Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the rebuilding of the temple, the story told in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. I'd like to begin by looking at the authorship of the book of Ezra. Now, he's not named, so we're not told who the author is, but Ezra serves as a sequel to the books of First and Second Chronicles. You say, well, what about First and Second Kings? No, I'm going to specifically say First and Second Chronicles because the last two verses of Second Chronicles are exactly the same as the first two verses of Ezra chapter 1. So they're actually, it sort of picks up on the same several sentences, the same two verses. The book of Ezra is found in the Hebrew Bible as one book with Nehemiah. So if you open up a Hebrew Bible or look at the Hebrew scriptures, you'll see Ezra and Nehemiah listed as one book, which means we have Zerubbabel's narrative. Zerubbabel, he's going to be the descendant of David, and he's going to be the leader in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. Then we're going to have Ezra himself introduced, but when we get to him, quite a number of years will have passed. So we have two separate stories. And then, of course, when we get to the book of Nehemiah, that's a still separate story, with Nehemiah himself being the main character. There are some sections, and specifically, these are sections in which letters are being written, official letters, chapter 4, verse 8 to chapter 6, verse 18. Now most of that's letter, although you have a little bit of explanatory text in the middle of that. And again, in chapters 7, verses 12 through 26. And these sections are written in Aramaic. It reminds us a little bit of the book of Daniel, which also has a Aramaic section. Aramaic is very close to Hebrew. If you're not paying attention, suddenly you're in Aramaic. Why is my Hebrew sounding so strange? The languages are very close, but they are two separate languages, but they're very, very close. Now, back in the Psalms, Psalm 137, we have the psalm that reminds the reader of the Babylonian captivity. It goes by the rivers of Babylon. There we sit down and wept when we remembered Zion. Zion, of course, is a reference to Jerusalem. Upon the willows in the midst of it, we hung our harps. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And then the psalmist asks, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? As the book of Ezra picks up, we're going to find the people of God in a foreign land, and they are remembering their homeland, and they are wishing to return. Now, this brings up what we call the Babylonian captivity. Notice our timeline. We have the kings of Judah going all the way up to about 586 BC, and there the temple is destroyed, and we enter the period of the Babylonian captivity. And as our story opens, it will be the year 539 BC, and we're going to see the return of exile begin. Notice some of the prophets that had led up to that period. Maybe Joel, we're not sure about him, but certainly Zephaniah and Habakkuk, maybe Obadiah. Ezekiel, his ministry had actually been over in Mesopotamia, but had been a part of that. And of course, Daniel, notice Daniel spans that entire gap, and we're going to look maybe in a different study about Daniel, the prophet statesman, but also the book of Daniel. Now, Judah had been carried off into captivity by the Babylonians. There had been actually 3 successive deportations. First Daniel and some of his friends had been taken, and then Ezekiel and 10,000 of the craftsmen, and finally the temple had been destroyed, and the rest of the Jews had been carried off into captivity. But after this, we begin to see the rise of a new power to the east of Babylon, the Medes to the north, and the Persians to the south. And one king bound them together. His name was Cyrus the Great. And you say, well, which was he? Was he a Mede and a Persian? And according to tradition, the answer is yes, that he was both, that his father was a Persian, his mother was a Mede. And it's not long before he is binding these two kingdoms together. He actually fights a war with the Lydians who had first attacked him, and he invades, going all the way to the city of Sardis, which is fairly close to the coast of the Aegean. And it's only after this that he comes up against Babylon. And when he does, according to his records, he takes Babylon without even a fight. And suddenly he has become the heir of what had been the Babylonian Empire. Notice the Babylonian Empire didn't last that long. And this is where our story picks up, Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, he had been king of Persia for a good deal longer, but now he has just taken over a much bigger area. And so we're going to call this the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah had prophesied not the coming of Cyrus per se. You actually find that, and I'm going to see that in a second over in Isaiah. But Jeremiah had prophesied that yes, the Jews are going to be taken into captivity, but they will eventually return. And so Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 1 through 12, and also Jeremiah 29:10 give a prophecy that not only will they be taken into captivity, but that they will return. And so we see that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. Isaiah chapters 44 and 45 actually prophesy about Cyrus, saying, God says, "You are my anointed. I've anointed you for a special purpose, even though you don't know me." And here the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. And we're going to see Cyrus saying some things that make us wonder, gee, is he a Christian? Is he a believer in the Lord? I'm not, I don't want to say either way because I don't know. I suspect not. But at the same time, we read here that the Lord was moving him, whether he realized it or not. And so stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Verse 2, thus says Cyrus, and here's the actual inscription, or at least a summary statement of it. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Notice, he doesn't say he's the God who's everywhere, but he's the God who's in Jerusalem. Verse 4, every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And you hear that, and you naturally assume, my goodness, Cyrus sounds like a Christian. You would think that was the case until you begin to read other things that Cyrus read for other cultures. Now, here's what is known as the Cyrus cylinder. It reads cuneiform, and we're looking at a translation here. I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Kengir, and Akkad, king of the four rims of the earth. Notice he's taken quite a bit of territory. Son of Cambyses, great king, king of the Achaemenid. When I entered Babylon as a friend, remember, he captured Babylon, but he captured it without a fight, at least according to his records. When I entered Babylon as a friend, now he wasn't a friend to the king of Babylon, he actually killed him, but he entered it and said, no, I'm here to liberate you. And this is a great public relations piece. When I entered Babylon as a friend, and when I established the seat of the government in the palace of the ruler under jubilation and rejoicing, Marduk, the great lord, this is the god of Babylon, Marduk, the great lord, induce the magnanimous inhabitants of Babylon to love me, and I was daily endeavoring to worship him. He goes in there and he says, "You love me," and maybe the idea with it was there, or else. But he's presenting himself not as the conqueror of Babylon, but as the liberator. He continues, Asher and Susa, Akkad, Shunan, the towns Zamban, Meturnu, Dir, as well as these regions of the Gutians. I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. Notice what he's doing. He's saying to all these people who have been dispossessed, whose temples have been plundered, go home, take your gods with you. These are the statues, the idols of your god, the images. They used to live there. Go back, rebuild, let your gods live there, and be sure you pay your taxes to me. He goes on to say, I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitation. So there's a mass migration, not commanded, but allowed. They're all allowed to go back home to rebuild, to be happy citizens under the Persian Empire, but now they'll have their own identities in their own cities. Now, Isaiah chapter 45, I noted, gives a prophecy. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, to loose the loins of kings. That's not a nice thing for the king, but it means he's going to be victorious. To open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. Notice how Isaiah promises all those things, and again, a rebuilding of Jerusalem at the hands and voice of Cyrus. For the sake of Jacob my servant, and Israel my chosen one, I have also called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, speaking of Cyrus again, though you have not known me. So Cyrus didn't know God. If this is Isaiah writing, and I usually take that it is, Cyrus wouldn't be born for 150 years or so. He didn't know God, but God calls him and says, I'm going to use you. I'm going to set you up to be the king, to accomplish what I want to accomplish. So Ezra chapter 1 and verse 5, then the heads of fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin, these are the tribes that had been taken into captivity. Now, remember, you say, what about the other 10 tribes? They're scattered as well. Some of them are going to come back too. But notice here the attention is on Judah and Benjamin. And the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. Verse 6, and all those about them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables. Notice who are all those about them. These are other people that are living in Mesopotamia. These, I think, also are other Jews. You see, not all the Jews are going to go up. Some will, but the greater number are going to stay behind. After all, they've been settled here, and who wants to go back to Judah and Jerusalem? You have to go back there and rebuild, and it's in ruins. But they support them. They encourage them with articles of silver and gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a freewill offering. Verse 7, also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and put in the house of his gods. You see, all the ornaments and the gold and the jewelry and the tables and various accoutrements had been taken from the temple. The temple itself had been burned and destroyed, but the articles of the house had been carried back to Babylon, had been counted and probably put into storage, and now Cyrus has taken over. And so he gives that back to them. So they're going to take all those things back and place them in the new rebuilt temple. Verse 8, and Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithridates, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Sheshbazzar is one of the descendants of David. He's in the royal line. If Israel still had a king, he would be the king, but now the Jews do not have a king anymore. So he's now just called a prince of Judah. And so chapter 1, we have the decree of Cyrus. Then in chapter 2, we have the numbering, a census really, of those who returned. Chapter 2, verse 1, there's an introductory statement that sort of sets the stage, says, now, these are the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. And then verses 2 through 35 are a listing of the various clans and families. It's the number of the people of Israel that are coming back. Next, verse 36 through 39, you have the number of the priests. And then verses 40 through 58, you have the number of the Levites. And then verse 59, you find that there are Levites who could not give evidence. They were not able to give evidence of their fathers' households and their descendants, whether they were of Israel. They didn't have the genealogical records to show their ancestry. And because of that, they're going to be put on hold. They're not going to be allowed to serve until it can be proven. Next, we have the priests, verses 61 through 63. You say, well, we already counted the priests, but there are some again, verse 62. These searched among their ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. And finally, verses 64 through 70 is a final count of the people, their possessions, and their offerings. Here it is, verse 64. The whole assembly numbered 42,360. Now, that tells me they might be rounding off to the nearest 10, but this is a pretty exact account. Besides their male and female servants, who numbered 7,337, we're getting quite exact here, and they had 200 singing men and women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, and their donkeys, a lot of donkeys here, 6,720. Now we come to chapter 3 and verse 1. Now when the 7th month came, and the sons of Israel were in the cities. They've made it back to the land. And the people were gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. The 7th month, that's a significant month. On the 7th month, you would have a series of feasts that are held in the fall. Now, you're not going to do this in the spring, because in the spring there's farming and there's growing and there's the harvest. You have to be there to do that. But now we're past that. We're in the 7th month. Verse 2, then Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brothers the priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his brothers arose and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So they've gotten back into the land, and notice the priest, but also the local ruler. When I say ruler, can't really call him a governor, because there's already a governor over the whole area, and he's not it. But he is the leader of the Jews. So we can call him a prince. That's Zerubbabel. And he's also a descendant of David. We mentioned his father earlier, but now this is Zerubbabel. And he's the leader. He's brought them back into the land. Verse 4, they celebrated the Feast of Booths. And like I said, there's 3 different things that take place. First of all, the beginning of that month would be the blowing of trumpets and signifying some things to come. And then Yom Kippur. But now the last of these feasts is the Feast of Booths, as it is written, and offered the fixed number of burnt offerings daily according to the ordinance as each day required. So they're back in the land, but not only are they back in the land, they've rebuilt at least an altar. The temple hasn't been rebuilt yet, but the altar has. And now they're doing sacrifices, and they celebrate the Feast of Booths. That's a celebration where everybody camps out. It's easy to camp out when your home has been destroyed, but they're camping out, remembering a time when back after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, they didn't have homes either. They were only living in tents. And so here they are sort of replaying that entire story, living it out. Verse 6, from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord had not been laid. So they've got an altar, but no temple. Verse 8, now in the 2nd year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who came from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work and appointed the Levites from 20 years and older to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. Now, finally, notice it's the second year now. And we've gone past the seventh month, and we've gone past the first month, past the Passover. Remember, I said you had to be planting the crops and things like that. But now you're waiting for the harvest, and now we're getting ready. And actually, by this time, maybe they've actually done the harvest, or at least some of it. Um, and of course, all that you're sort of getting things back on track. But now they're getting ready for the work. And so the work of reconstruction begins. And as it begins, we read in verse 11, old men wept with a loud voice, and there were many who shouted aloud for joy. And notice, you've got weeping, and you've got joyful shouting, and there's so much going on, it's hard to tell who is who. There's a lot of weeping and yelling and shouting, and some are happy, and some are remembering what it used to be, and we're going to see sort of both ideas here. Chapter 4, verse 1, as the building continues, it's not done yet. Chapter 4, verse 1, now when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' households and said to them, let us build with you. You say, well, is that an enemy? Well, they're going to be enemies. I don't know if they realize they are yet. Maybe initially unintended enemies, but they say, oh, a temple's being built. Here, let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God, and we've been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. Now, this is speaking of those that lived to the north of Jerusalem, in what had been the territory of the northern kingdom of Israel, in places like Samaria. But notice, these were not necessarily all Jewish people. They had been brought here when the people of those northern tribes had been taken into captivity. So the Assyrians had relocated the Israelites to another place, and they had relocated these people into the land, and they'd come into the land, and they'd say, well, what gods do you worship here? And somebody said, well, Yahweh, the God of Israel. And they said, okay, we'll worship him too. Now, notice, it's very likely they brought their own gods as well, but they had said, well, what's one more god? We'll worship that too. Oh, a temple to that god. Here, let's come and join ourselves to that, and we'll bring our syncretism and our pagan worship that's mixed with the worship of God, and that's not going to sit very well. So in verse 3, Zerubbabel and Yeshua and the rest of the heads of fathers' households of Israel said to them, you have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God, but we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. And so notice the offer is rebuffed, and those who were at first sounding like friends suddenly are going to be enemies. Verse 4, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now you have Cyrus, but it's not going to go from Cyrus to Darius. There's actually going to be another king in the middle of that. And so throughout this entire period, we have these people that are set up against the Jews that are rebuilding the temple. Now, chapter 4, verse 6, we have a couple of comments with regard to some of this enmity and some of this that is against them. Verse 6, now in the reign of Ahasuerus. And that's a little problematic. Ahasuerus, Ahash Yarosh is the way the Hebrew reads it. And so we anglicize it a little bit. And Ahasuerus, we're going to see that name used for the king in the book of Esther. That's commonly thought to be Xerxes. I'm not sure that that's correct. And I'm not saying the king in Esther isn't Xerxes. I'm saying that the term Ahasuerus, I think, might be a royal title or a royal name that's held by several different people. So now, I could be wrong here. Maybe this is Xerxes. But you say, wait a minute, Xerxes, he's going to come after Darius. He's coming quite a bit later. And if that's the case, then these are just notations of how this sort of antagonism continued to a much later date. But I think maybe that's not the case. So notice, now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. If given the context, I think my answer is perhaps a better one. And then in verse 7, and in the days of Artaxerxes, he's going to come even after Xerxes. But Artaxerxes, or Artashashita, is the Hebrew again, but we anglicize it to Artaxerxes, and that's fine. I think. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabil, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, same name there, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. So again, presuming that that's correct, is this Cambyses? Is again another name for him? I'm not sure. So I don't want to say, but these two verses are a little bit of a problem, just trying to decipher. In any case, what's happened is Cyrus the Great had given permission to rebuild, but now that permission is going to be rescinded. You say, well, did Cyrus rescind it? Actually, a few years later, Cyrus had died, and now his son, Cambyses, is the emperor. Now, he's not personally getting involved, but unless he's one of those names, called Artaxerxes in our text. Again, I don't want to say that's the case. But under Cambyses, the construction is going to be halted. And it will remain halted for quite a number of years until, and we are going to read about it here in Ezra, but also we read about it in the books of Haggai and Zechariah. These two prophets get up and they prophesy and they urge the construction to begin again, even though the Jews do not have permission from the Persian overlords. And so, chapter 5, verse 1, when the prophets Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them, then Zerubbabel, he's still around, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Jehozadak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So notice how you've got the prophet, the priest, there's no king, but you have the descendant of the king, Zerubbabel, sort of standing in for that. He has not taken the title of king, but he is the leader of the Jews. Verse 3, at that time, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river. Now, when it says beyond the river, that doesn't mean he's over in Mesopotamia. That means he's on this side of Mesopotamia. That's what would be called beyond the river to the Persians. And also Sheth bar Bozenai and their colleagues came to them and spoke to them thus, who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish this structure? You don't have your building permit. Remember, it was rescinded. Who told you you could start again? Verse 4, then we told them according to what the names of the men were who were reconstructing this building. And so they're given, here's the people in charge. Verse 5, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report could come to Darius. By now, Darius is the emperor of the Persians. And then a written reply could be returned concerning it. So you have a letter now, and we're actually told, we have the details of the letter. We actually have the letter. It's written to the Persian emperor, that's chapter 5, verses 6 through 17. And it's mailed off. Darius had actually set up a postal system, not for everybody, but for official business. So it makes its way all the way to the capital of Persia. And then we have a return letter from the Persian Empire. This is chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, that comes back. Now some time passes, but while it's passing, they're still rebuilding. They had not stopped. And as a result of this, notice we started with Cyrus, who had given permission. Cambyses, under him, the construction had been halted. And the letter of Darius comes back, and he gives permission for them to complete the work of the temple. You see, he has an investigation made. And in the investigation, they come out with the letter that Cyrus had first written, and it's on file. And he says, "Oh my!" And it's not his father. It's his sort of a distant cousin. "Oh my cousin Cyrus the Great gave permission. In that case, it's okay. They can continue the work." What is more, chapter 6, verse 8, the full cost is to be paid for these people from the royal treasury out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river, and that without delay. It even says something to the effect, if anybody delays it, then let him be impaled with a beam from his own house. That's sort of typical Persian warning. But notice, not only are they allowed to continue, but the Persian Empire is going to pay for it. After all, it came out of Jewish taxes, but still, that's a nice thing. They get a tax break. Verse 13, then Tatenai, remember he's the governor of the province beyond the river, who had first said, "Why are you rebuilding?" And not only him, but also Shethar-bozenai and their colleagues carried out the decree with all diligence, just as King Darius had sent. So in the same way they were threatening to halt the work, now they are endorsing it with money and funds and permission and all that goes with it. Chapter 6, verse 14, and the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they finished building according to the command of God, the God of Israel, and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Verse 15, this temple was completed. This is an artist's conception of what it would have looked like. And you say, I've seen pictures of Solomon's temple. It looked much more ornate than that. Yes, exactly. I think that's correct. It's not going to be nearly so ornate. It will have the same basic overall dimensions, but it won't be near as ornate. And you're going to have, especially Haggai, that's going to be referenced in his writing. We'll see that in another class. So this temple was completed on the third day of the month Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of Darius, which tells us the date for that is going to be 516 BC. Remember how the temple had been destroyed 586 BC? This is 70 years later, where it's now being completed, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy of a 70-year captivity. Verse 16, and the sons of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. Verse 17, they offered for the dedication of this temple of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats corresponding to the number of the tribes of Israel. Notice they're not just saying it's Judah and Benjamin. This is for all Jews, all Israelites, wherever they may be. Verse 18, then they appointed the priests to their divisions and the Levites in their orders for the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. The exiles observed the Passover. Now, wait a second. We've gone an entire year now coming back to the next Passover. On the first month, verse 20, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were pure. It's taken some time to do this, but now they've done this. Then they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, both for their brothers, the priests, and for themselves. The sons of Israel who returned from exile, and all those who had separated themselves from the impurity of the nations of the land to join them to seek the Lord, God of Israel, ate the Passover. And so we have it's coming full circle. Do you remember how the Israelites had eaten the first Passover before leaving Egypt? That's what the Passover commemorated. And here they are. They've left. They've left Mesopotamia, and they've come back into the land. They've come full circle, coming back to the place where God has now planted them as they eat that Passover. Verse 22, and they observed the feast of unleavened bread. This is part of the Passover week. They observed the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had caused them to rejoice and had turned the heart, and here, notice there, the heart of the king of Assyria. You say, wait a minute, king of Assyria. Assyrians have been out for quite some time. Yes, but Babylon, remember, had conquered Assyria, and then the Medes and the Persians had conquered Babylon. So again, God has turned the heart of those that live far off, and even though Assyria is no longer a country, it's the Persians that are ruling that former land. And so we've come full circle. Those that took the Israelites out of the land, now peoples from that same area are causing them to come back into the land, and even paying for the rebuilding of the temple. Notice that turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them to encourage them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. And so here's the outline of the section. We had the decree of Cyrus in chapter 1, the number of those who returned in chapter 2, and then chapters 3 through 6 were the rebuilding of the temple, where it was begun in chapter 3. We had the halting in chapter 4. The work was halted. It was completed. It was finished in chapter 5. And now, actually it was being done. It wasn't finished yet. And in chapter 6, remember, the permission was given. It was approved by the Persians and now completed. Now, every once in a while, I'm asked, what about the prophecies of the rebuilding of the temple? And I want to point out that they were being fulfilled, and they were fulfilled here in Zerubbabel's day. That the prophets had said the temple would be rebuilt and restored, and here it was rebuilt and restored. It would be later embellished, and it would get bigger in later days, and then in the days of Herod the Great, he's going to make it very big. But is there a prophecy of another temple that would be raised up and rebuilt? And the answer is yes. It was Jesus himself who gave that prophecy. He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, the good news, John chapter 2 and verse 19, that give us that prophecy. It tells us in that the next verse, I think that's the verse where it tells us that he spoke of the temple of his body, that he is the temple that was destroyed and raised up again and lives forever for us.